Hi all, welcome to your week 4 reading guide video. We're going to be talking about basically biodiversity this week, biotic patterns and processes in ecosystems. I'm going to try to keep this video a little bit shorter than the other two because I think it might help with attention span and actually wanting to watch these things. So I'm going to run through things pretty quickly, hopefully, and then if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email me, call me at 786-6854, or stop by my office in 208 BMH. I have office hours from 11:30 to 12:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays regularly each week, and then other times by appointment. So would love to meet all of you since I never get to see you in person. Okay, so these are things to keep in the back of your mind as you read this chapter and listen to this reading guide. We're talking about biodiversity. That means that we're talking about the variety of life on Earth. So in previous chapters, we've talked about some of the abiotic things that affect life on Earth, and this week we're really talking about some of the patterns and processes that affect actual life on Earth, which of course is mostly interesting to all of us. So things to keep in the back of your mind. What are the environmental issues regarding biodiversity? What have you heard? What do you know about? Is it polar bears declining in population? Is it walruses competing for ice? Is it tropical birds that you may have seen if you've been on a visit to Hawaii? Why do we care about biodiversity? What's the big deal? Why is it important that people want to go save all these different species? And is this a scientific issue? Is it an issue of how we do this from a scientific perspective, or is it an issue of motivation and compassion on the part of humans to actually want to save different species? So think about the scientific sort of basis of this issue of protecting and caring about biodiversity. Okay, so quickly, organization. Life on planet Earth is organized into multiple levels. We have individual organisms, like you and me. We have species, which is a collection of physically similar organisms, generally that can interbreed with each other. So the human species is obviously one. Polar bears, walruses, squirrels, magpie, birds that you hear calling in the trees, those are all species. Populations are generally smaller organizational level than species. There are groups of individuals of a single species living in one environment and exposed to the same conditions. So we think of, for example, polar bears as being a circumpolar species. They exist in the northern reaches of countries all around the Arctic Circle. But we might have a population of bears that lives just in Alaska and never comes into contact with bears that live in eastern Canada. So we would call those two different populations. Communities are multiple species. So species and populations, just one species. Communities, multiple species, but same constraints as populations, multiple species living in a single environment and exposed to the same conditions. And then, of course, an ecosystem we've defined before, that's multiple species living in a single environment, but it also includes all of the abiotic factors they depend on, like weather and climate and nutrient cycling and water availability and energy flow and all of those different things that we've already talked about. So two of the most important processes that affect our biodiversity are evolution and natural selection. And I'm going to assume that you guys have all heard these terms before. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands the difference between them. Evolution is the gradual change in genetic inherited characteristics of a species or population through time. So it can be things like how a population looks, it can be things like how they behave, it can be other things that we don't really notice because they're internal physiological processes, but it's just change through time. Now, evolution typically happens by natural selection, and this is changes in the frequency of traits, so genetic traits, that are favorable to the success of an individual, and that those traits increase over subsequent generations. So that's kind of wordy and doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but we've all heard of natural selection being survival of the fittest, right? And so that means that as an organism gets better at dealing with its environment and surviving in its environment, those traits that allow it to survive are going to get passed on favorably by positive selection for the more adapted organism and negative selection for the less adapted organism. And so that creates this process of change through time, which we call evolution. So the key points to natural selection is that the difference between two individuals in terms of their behavior, appearance, physiology, whatever, has to be inheritable. So it has to be able to be passed from parent to child. Otherwise, there's no way for differential survival to create a situation where you get survival of the fittest, right? Then there has to be differential reproductive success. So the animals that are better adapted to their environment have to be able to reproduce and survive better than the ones that aren't. And that leads to this successive process of more favorable characteristics increasing in frequency in the population through time. That's natural selection. And then gradually, as those favorable characteristics are propagated through the population or the species, then you get this process of evolution. And I just want to make sure everybody understands too that natural selection is not the same as mutation. Mutation is random variation in DNA. It can be beneficial, but it could also be detrimental or neutral. It provides some of the variation on which natural selection acts, but it is not the same as natural selection. And so what I'd like everybody to think about for just a minute is what is going on in this diagram I've got on this slide with green and the brown beetles. Okay, so just to sum that up, we've got, first of all, variation in beetle color, right? And we're going to assume that's heritable, that green beetles have green babies and brown beetles have brown babies. Then in the middle bubble, we have a bird eating the green beetles, showing that those green beetles are surviving less well because the bird can see them better, and therefore they're reproducing less well to pass on those green genes. And over time, we expect that there will be more brown beetles in that population passing on their genetic material that allows the population to evolve to become more brown than green over time. Hopefully that makes sense. So why do we need to know this? Why in a class on environmental science do we really care about evolution and natural selection? As I've alluded to already, evolution by natural selection results in an organism being more adapted to its environment. So evolution can be a process by which we get more biodiversity, and that we do care about in terms of our environment. Evolution and natural selection can also reduce biodiversity because if a species can't adapt, it could go extinct. And unfortunately, human-caused environmental change has increased the rate of extinction in recent decades. So this is kind of what things are looking like over historical time. So the graph in the upper right of your slide here shows species extinction rates compared to human population growth rates. So extinction numbers in number of species are on the left, population of humans in the millions is on the right. And you can see that as the human population, this top line, has increased since about 1900, the number of extinctions has also gone up. So some people refer to this as us living in the sixth major extinction, where our activities as humans in our environment are causing a loss of biodiversity on a large scale. So your book kind of makes a switch and goes from talking about evolution and natural selection, which are two processes determining how much biodiversity there is in the world, to this process of population ecology, which really determines how many of each species there are in the world. So remember, species are a group of similar organisms, and most of them can freely interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Now that concept of a population are individuals of a species, single species that are all living in the same place at the same time, so they're exposed to the same environment. So that's a key distinction, because typically we don't think about trying to calculate how many of an entire species are on the planet at the same time. We're usually focused on a sub-part population of that species, because that's all that might be in a single state, or a part of the ocean, or might be declining as a result of human exposure. So how does the environment affect these populations? Basically, it affects the abundance or the density of any particular population by virtue of the fact that animals depend on their environment to survive. So animals in a population that are reacting to certain aspects of their environment are going to have changes in birth rates, death rates, and dispersal in and out of that area. So I'd like to ask everyone to look at this map here on the right of your slide and see if you can think about why populations of humans are much more on the east coast and the east side of the country and the west coast, and less in the middle part of the country, particularly in the western half. And if you said that's driven by rainfall, you're absolutely correct. It's harder to make a living in places where there's less rain. So that determines how our human population is distributed across our country. And the same is true of other organisms, but they, of course, respect geographic boundaries far less than humans do. So we can calculate things like population growth rates, which is the number of individuals that are being added to a population through time, by looking at the number of births minus the number of deaths, plus the number of animals coming into the population through immigration, minus the number of animals leaving the population through emigration. So we can tell how well a population is doing in a given environment by how fast it is growing. Positive numbers for this population growth rate R means the population is growing, negative numbers mean it's declining, and then if R is 0, what do you think is going on? Population is stable, exactly. So down in the notes section of this slide, I have some examples you're welcome to work through. And you can find these, if it's blurry on this video, you can go into the PowerPoint that's attached to this week's learning module and actually look at the notes that way. So it's a good idea to go in and kind of think about how to calculate that rate of R. Your book also talks about the conventional way of notating births and deaths in a population is the number out of 1,000. So then you end up getting fractions, and you get a percentage of the original population that growth represents. So if you have plus 10% growth, obviously your population is increasing faster than 5% growth, and if you have a negative 5%, then the population is declining. Your book also talks a lot about environmental resistance or environmental constraints. These are things that prevent populations from growing indefinitely or exponentially. And these are often things that we would normally think of as limiting resources. So things like water, food, denning sites, if you're an animal that needs to excavate a burrow to have babies. And animals have to compete for these limited resources. So the ones that compete better survive and reproduce better, which is the process of natural selection, right? So the strongest animals survive, weaker individuals die or don't reproduce. And so these environmental constraints or environmental resistance has a negative feedback effect on population growth. So as I mentioned already, environmental constraints or environmental resistance is another way of talking about limiting resources or limited resources. So we talked about this with nutrient cycling. These are things that can basically prevent exponential growth, or if added too much to a situation, can create exponential growth, right? So in this picture, what do you think is the limiting resource or the environmental constraint? If you said water, you're absolutely correct. This is a picture of Africa, particularly in the Serengeti. You can see that all these animals are congregating around this watering hole. And so the water in this case is a limited resource or a limiting resource. It prevents, because there's not very much of it, it prevents the animals' populations from getting too large because they have to travel so far across the desert to get to these watering holes. And so that travel time and the amount of competition they experience for this water prevents their populations from growing exponentially. I also want to mention the concept of population growth and carrying capacity. Your book talks a lot about carrying capacity as being the maximum number of organisms that a population of animals or an environment can support. I want to make sure everybody understands that carrying capacity fluctuates throughout the year. So we refer to typically carrying capacity as the winter population size of most animals that reproduce on an annual basis. And you can have a greater number of organisms in the population than the carrying capacity is after you have babies in the summer. And then that surplus number of animals is decreased through density dependent and density independent effects throughout that fall season and on into the winter, so that in the spring your population size should be back somewhere around or below carrying capacity. Species interactions, I'm not going to go through these particularly in detail because your book does, but the four big ones that I want everyone to understand: competition, mutualism, and symbiosis, which is those two are pretty similar. Commensalism, and then predation and parasitism are sort of in their own category. So when we think about scaling up from the level of biodiversity that considers just species or populations into the level of biodiversity that comprises these multiple groups of species living in the same environment, we start to think about a concept we call the ecological niche. And your book goes through this quite specifically, but what I want to make sure everybody understands is it's not just the habitat within which an animal lives, it's the specific task or function that animal provides in that habitat, what it does to survive and reproduce. And it's important to understand that no two individuals can theoretically occupy exactly the same niche. We call that the competitive exclusion principle. Otherwise, one would always outcompete the other, right? So in the case of these shorebirds over here on the right side of the screen, you can see that each bird has a slightly different bill length, and that enables them to get at a different source of invertebrate prey than other birds. And so they're giving themselves the maximum opportunity to differentiate themselves in terms of prey food sources, and we call that resource partitioning, so that they are partitioning the available resources into slots that each different species can occupy and therefore specialize in, and hopefully remain competitively viable. And then the last thing I want to talk about is succession. So your book talks about this, but the one thing it doesn't make particularly clear is the fact that succession is not a unidirectional stop at this climax community and never change process. Succession can happen again and again and again in the same community, depending on the disturbance that changes that ultimate community. So in this case, you've got annual plants, perennial plants, shrubs, softwood trees, and then hardwood trees. At any point in that process, you can have a disturbance that changes the community and sets it back to a previous point in that succession. So it's kind of a circular process more so than a linear process. You want to make sure everybody understands that disturbance is really the factor that changes that that process and makes it reset itself, and it can happen again and again and again in any community or ecosystem. Okay, so I'm going to conclude there. I don't know that I made this much shorter, but hopefully it was semi-interesting and covered a few of the points that your book doesn't make quite so clear. I'd love to know if you guys think these videos are helpful, and I will talk to you next week. Bye!